So before we get started with the webinar, just a few words about Clear Seas. For those of you that aren't familiar with us, we are an independent non-for-profit focused on supporting safe and sustainable marine shipping. And we do that through a whole range of research and communication products on topical issues that we aim at the general public, at policymakers, and at the marine industry itself. And this project is one of those projects. So we distribute that information to our audience mainly through our webpage. You see some statistics there about our web users, and we do that in both French and English. And at Clear Seas, we believe that better information provides for better decisions. So let's get informed. Jennifer, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So next I'm going to provide some background on the Sensitive Coastal Areas project and how it relates to our other research initiatives on marine shipping here at Clear Seas. I'm also going to give an overview of the project, the objectives and scope, before handing over to Dave Krieber for a deeper dive into the methodology. So Canada's coast depends on a healthy ocean, which is important to all Canadians. So our research with the Angus Reid Institute tells us that 39% of Canadians feel that the environmental risks of shipping oil outweigh the economic benefit. Although oil spills are rare events in Canada, and although they have declined dramatically on a global scale over the last 3 decades, this all being despite increasing volumes of oil being shipped, oil spills are still a top-of-mind concern for Canadians. So in fact, based on our Angus Reid survey results, the potential for an oil spill remains a top concern of Canadians when it comes to marine shipping. So with 67% and 54% of survey respondents indicating this as their top concern in 2016 and 2018 respectively. So to help address these concerns and help better understand the risks related to marine shipping activities, Clear Seas has undertaken a multi-layered analysis to support marine spatial planning on the Pacific coast. So I think I need to move to a next slide. Thank you. So this work, our Marine Transportation Corridors Initiative, includes 5 different components. The first is a vessel drift and response analysis. So in this work, we assess potential ship drift rates versus the location and availability of emergency tow vessels or rescue tugs to rescue a disabled ship before it could drift aground. We also completed an emergency towing vessel needs assessment. This work identifies the capabilities needed to rescue large and high-winded ships in moderate to severe wind and wave conditions. So another piece of work under this umbrella is the Clear Seas Tugs of Opportunity study. This study examined the availability and capabilities of non-rescue tugs, known as Tugs of Opportunity, to assist disabled ships along the Pacific coast. We're also currently finishing a vessel traffic and petroleum movements analysis. This work involves an analysis of the travel patterns of commercial ships and the associated movement of oil, considering both oil carried as fuel and oil carried as cargo. We're hoping to publish this report in the next few months, so stay tuned. So finally, the last component of the Marine Transportation Corridors Initiative, and what we're here to talk about today, is our work on assessing the sensitivity of coastal areas to oil spills. The objective of this assessment is to identify areas along the Pacific coast that are sensitive to oil spills in a way that accounts for the biological, physical, and socioeconomic values in coastal areas. So by mapping the vulnerability of coastal areas to harm from spills, the results of the study are intended to support marine spatial planning discussions by providing and combining data sets for new perspectives on impacts from shipping activity. So it's not intended to be a detailed primary resource for spill response planning. So we've started this work in the Pacific region. The intent is to develop a methodology using the Pacific region and then to apply it to other regions in Canada, namely the Atlantic coast and then the Arctic. So a bit of a project overview. The study area for the Sensitive Coastal Areas Assessment was defined based on our Marine Transportation Corridors Initiative I just spoke about. So we chose this study area to complement the work that we did looking at vessel drift rates. This was initially geographically defined by areas where risk associated with a disabled and drifting vessel could be modeled. The study area excludes areas east of Vancouver Island and the Strait of Juan de Fuca, as much of the area between Vancouver Island and the mainland features narrow channels, this meaning that the potential response time to recover a disabled vessel before it drifts aground is very short. So the sensitivity assessment contains over 400 different data layers gathered from different sources, including government, nonprofit, and academic sources. It's based on the best available publicly accessible data sets that were available at the time of the analysis. So we chose to limit the assessment to publicly available data sets that could be easily obtained and used without licensing, so that the results of the assessment could be shared without restriction. The data that we use may not represent the most comprehensive or current information. So there's potential that additional data layers exist from different sources, including federal, provincial, and municipal governments, First Nations, and non-governmental organizations. So the data was analyzed to identify areas within the study area that are relatively more vulnerable if an oil spill were to occur near them. To better define the values along the coast that could be affected, the study takes an innovative approach that considers the combined effect of biological, physical, and socioeconomic factors to understand the overall sensitivity of the Pacific region to the potential impact of an oil spill. The study also identifies the importance of including a fourth category that considers traditional knowledge and sensitive Indigenous areas. An Indigenous category would need to be developed at a future date in partnership with First Nations, who have rights and interests and a deep connection to the lands and waters in the study area. So this analysis isn't static. We expect that it'll evolve over time as additional data becomes available, and as a result of consultation and engagement with the users of the map and with groups who are the providers of information on which the tool is based. So with that context in mind, I'm going to invite Dave Kreber from Dillon Consulting to give us more detail about the assessment methodology. So over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you everybody for attending today. I'm going to just briefly go over the methodology over the next few slides, starting with sort of the sensitive coastal areas along the Pacific coast, the study area. The approximately 450,000 square kilometer study area represented in this figure extends from the Washington state BC border to the south to the BC-Alaska state border in the north. The eastern boundary of the study area is defined by the Pacific coast of Canada, including the west coast of Vancouver Island, Haida Gwaii, Dixon Entrance, Queen Charlotte Sound, and Hecate Strait. The western boundary of the study area is the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone of Canada. As Jennifer alluded to, the study area excludes the east inside of Vancouver Island and the Straits of Juan de Fuca. The study area was divided into a grid cell measuring 2 nautical miles by 2 nautical miles. This was done to allow us to display the information adequately and develop the heat maps, which we'll show later. Where the grid cell includes shoreline, the grid cell is aligned to the high water mark of the shoreline. Next slide, please. The Coastal Sensitivity Score identifies areas and regions within the study area that are relatively more vulnerable to harm from an oil spill if it occurs near them. The Coastal Sensitivity Score is determined for each grid cell within the study area and is an aggregate of the sensitivity score for each of the 3 sensitivity categories, being the biological sensitivity, the physical sensitivity, and the social economic sensitivity. Each individual sensitivity score, the biological, physical, and social economic, were determined first and then rolled up to provide the overall coastal sensitivity score. I must stress this method does not indicate the extent, level of impact, or the likelihood that a specific oil spill will occur in the area. To obtain the coastal sensitivity score, each of the 3 individual sensitivity categories were summed together on a per grid cell basis. Each individual category received a score from very low to very high, depending on their level of sensitivity. The results for each individual category are added together for each grid cell, and the cumulative result is displayed using a 5-step scale that is used to indicate its relative sensitivity to being negatively affected by an oil spill. The 5-step scale is indicated on the chart here, as well as the overall coastal sensitivity score map is presented here. Jim, in his presentation on the web map, will present some additional visuals on this. Now we will discuss the individual scores. Further details on each of these individual scores is provided in the report in Appendix E. The biological sensitivity includes areas that have significant ecological value and high conservation value, which contain receptors such as species and habitats that would be negatively impacted by an oil spill. The biological sensitivity score was determined from work completed by the British Columbia Marine Conservation Analysis that identified areas of high conservation value, which are defined as areas that are important to effectively representing and conserving marine biodiversity. The data compiled by the BCMA was used to determine biological sensitivity since it was the most complete data set available at the time. The overall purpose of the BCMCA data was to identify marine areas of high conservation value in Canada's Pacific Ocean, and thus areas that were highly susceptible to negative impacts from oil spill. The BCMCA accomplished this by compiling 200 different layers of mapped biological information and processing it using a decision support tool called the Marksim analysis. Areas in red in the map displayed indicate areas that are highly susceptible to negative impacts from oil spills. Now, let's talk about the physical sensitivity score. The physical sensitivity score includes key physical characteristics of the shoreline and seafloor that could support different types of habitats and would be negatively affected if exposed to oil. This score does not consider the level of effort required to clean oil from the different types of physical attributes. And the physical sensitivity score is made at the shoreline and the seafloor. The shoreline sensitivity score is determined by shoreline classification and shoreline exposure summed together. Together, these account for the shoreline's geology, exposure to wave and tidal action, slope, substrate, permeability, and biological productivity. The shoreline classifications are based on the 11 Environmental and Climate Change Canada shoreline types and their geological makeup, and are ranked from the least sensitive, like a bedrock cliff, to the most sensitive, which is a marsh. The exposure takes into 6 different types of exposures, from a very protected shoreline to a very exposed shoreline. The shoreline sensitivity score combines the shoreline classification for each type of shoreline, presents in a grid cell, and determines the overall shoreline sensitivity score for that grid cell. Next slide, please. As illustrated in this, from very high to very low. Similar to shoreline characteristics, seafloor type can promote or deter biological activity and can provide resistance or have susceptibility to ship source oil spills. There are 3 types of seafloors within the study area as illustrated on this. Hard substrate, which include continuous and discontinuous bedrock and boulders. Soft substrate, which includes substrate types such as mud, sand, and combined mud and sand. And sort of a mixed substrate, which are such things as gravel, mixed sediments, sand, and gravel. The seafloor score for each grid cell is determined. Next slide, please. As illustrated here, based on the substrate. And then what we do is we combine both the seafloor sensitivity score and the shoreline sensitivity score to yield the overall physical sensitivity score illustrated in this figure here. Next slide, please. The social economic score is composed of 6 subcategories, and let's talk about each one. The figure here initially shows the combined overall social economic sensitivity score. The first one is the commercial fishing sensitivity score. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, go back one. All right. The commercial fishing score represents the social economic value of commercial fishing in each of the study areas. Values were provided in catch weight or the number of fish caught, and they were combined together to yield the overall commercial fishing sensitivity score. The next subcomponent was the tourism sensitivity score, and accounts for the potential losses to the tourism economy that an oil spill could cause. The score was determined using tourism employment statistics and known tourism sites within the study area. Tourism employment was determined using accommodation and food service employment data from the 2019 census as an indicator for overall tourism employment data. As well, known tourism features such as dive sites, marinas, and campsites were also included in the analysis to provide an overall tourism sensitivity score. The port facilities sensitivity score accounts for the presence of commercial port and port facilities within the study area. This includes designated ports under the Canada Marine Act, as well as other ports, terminals, shipyards, and harbors identified by the province of BC. And the port facility sensitivity score was determined by the presence or absence of port facilities in each of the grid cells. The water resource sensitivity score accounts for the presence of saltwater intakes within the study area that are used for various purposes, including power generation, plant cooling, industrial intakes, fish processing plants, and aquaculture sites. The category also considers industries that rely on water lots to store raw materials, for instance, log booms. The water sensitivity score was determined for each of these point sources and scored from a finite distance from them. The population density score accounts for the number of people that would be directly affected in the event of a spill. Areas of high population density are likely to have a larger number of people impacted from an oil spill. Therefore, areas of a high population density were considered more sensitive than areas of a low population density. Finally, the last category in the social economic is the parks and cultural areas. This includes national, provincial, and municipal parks, as well as important cultural areas along the shoreline. Important cultural areas include archaeological sites and other historical sites. This data was obtained from Natural Resources Canada and the province of BC. All 6 of these categories are then combined together to yield the overall social economic sensitivity score, which is depicted on your screen in that figure. Next slide, please. Some additional parameters. Sensitive Indigenous areas. At the time when we built the model was built for the provision of adding sensitive Indigenous sites in the future. However, it wasn't included. At the time that we built the model, insufficient data was available to assess Indigenous sensitivity, and we did not liaise with our Indigenous partners on that. Another provision of the model is the model is built to allow weighting of the different categories. Each of the coastal sensitivities are now given the same weight to yield the overall coastal sensitivity score. The biological, the physical, and the social economic each account for 1/3 of the overall score. However, the model was built to allow adjustments, both in the overall roll-up of the coastal sensitivity score and the individual parameters. So, for instance, if we wanted to weight the biological sensitivity score more, that could be done. Or if we wanted to weight the individual components of the physical sensitivity score, whether that's a shoreline score or the seafloor score, we could adjust those weightings either way. And finally, at the time, the model was built with the best information available at the time of the development. However, we built this model in a GIS database, and it allows for updating the information as more and better information becomes available. So it's designed to be a dynamic database that as better information becomes available, it can be integrated into the database. I'm now going to turn over the presentation to Jim, who's going to demonstrate the web map. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Dave. Much appreciated. So I'm just going to actually stop sharing my screen for 1 second and get a link to the web map that I'm going to put into the chat. So if anyone is interested in following along with us, you can do so there. Wonderful. Excellent. So, welcome to the Sensitive Coastal Areas web map. This web map is designed to help you and anyone who may be interested explore in more detail why places along the coast have the sensitivity scores that they do. So I'm going to focus on one specific place as an example and show you how to discover more about the data underlying the sensitivity score. So this is what the web map looks like when it first loads. There's a tutorial video that you can access here on the information panel that goes through all of the basic functions. But to follow along here, you'll just need to know about 3. You'll need to know how to zoom in and out, just these little plus and minus buttons on the side, how to turn on and off layers. So clicking on this layer icon, giving it a second to load. There we go. So to turn on and off layers, you just tick or untick them. And then how to see the breakdown for each grid cell. So this is actually something that's very cool. when the sensitivity layer is on, you can click on a grid cell and it will show you the breakdown of each major sensitivity category that contributes to that overall sensitivity score. So I've chosen a place that has good representation in each sensitivity category for this demonstration, but this does work for anywhere along the coast. So we'll be looking at the waters around Kitkatla, south of Porter Island on the north coast, right here. So I'm going to just zoom in a little bit so we can see this better. And of course, it's a drag to move around. So let's take a look at the breakdown. We're interested in all around through this bay, and we can see that it's mostly high sensitivity, and then there's these two zones, this one right by Kitkatla, of very high sensitivity. So let's investigate that. So as you can see, this increased sensitivity, or this very high sensitivity, is mostly coming from the biological and the physical layers. The socioeconomic sensitivity score is medium. If we look at the other one, it's much the same, except that the socioeconomic sensitivity is now high. So let's start with biological. This is how I would look at it. We'll turn off overall sensitivity and look at just the biological sensitivity. So there we are. We can see that all up through the bay, we have a very high biological sensitivity. If you click on that, it'll show you. And I chose this area partly because it's actually easy to find out more information about it. So it's in a zone of marine protection. So you can turn on the areas of marine protection layer there and click on this. And then you'll see there's this little 1 of 3, which means that there's a few different layers that you could have clicked on there. And here we are. You just click on the arrow through and you can see that this is a conservancy managed by the government of British Columbia. It was established in 2006. And there's a link here to the BC Parks website if you're interested in finding out more. I've already done that work for us today. We can find out that this conservancy was established to help protect the biological diversity and natural environment by protecting representative coastal flora and fauna, plant communities, animal species at risk, and special features, particularly lowland coastal muskeg, so bogs and fens and bog forests, as well as many other things, including a gray whale rubbing beach, sea lion haulout, significant seabird and shorebird feeding and molting area. So that's that for the biological area. Let's move on and take a look at the physical sensitivity. So we can see here it goes to medium through much of the inlet with a patch of high here and very high in the same two cells as we saw in the earlier breakdown. So we can see that this is coming from the sea floor. So the sea floor sensitivity score is very high and the shoreline sensitivity score is high. And if we look at this figure from the report that Dave showed earlier, we can zoom in here on the inlet that we're looking at and see that there's this dark purple here right up through there. So if we zoom out again, we can see this is a soft substrate, so mud, sand, or silt. And that contributes to the high sensitivity score. For reference, these figures can be found in the report. So feel free to download these. They're in the appendix. So now let's take a look at the shoreline as well. We're seeing there's a high sensitivity of the shoreline there. So much the same way, this is a figure from the report. We'll zoom in here, take a look. Right around here, we can see there's lots of green, some orange, and some red. So if we go over to our legend here, we can see that red is marsh, which, as Dave mentioned, is the most sensitive shoreline category. Orange is mud tidal flat or sand tidal flat, so I think we can wrap that up as tidal flats. And then green, we're seeing that that's a mixed sediment feature bank. So these are all shoreline types that have a high sensitivity score. Let's move on from physical and take a look at socioeconomic sensitivity. And there we go. We can see that there's a lot of medium and some high. So if we click right here, we can see that the socioeconomic sensitivity, the high score, is mostly coming from very high water resource use, not a lot of tourism employment, very high tourism features. There's marinas and campsites all around here. Commercial fishery has a high sensitivity. And then if we go over and click right around here, there we are. We can see that right around Kitkatla, there are port facilities. And so that contributes to a very high sensitivity score. So to summarize what we've learned, let's go back to the overall sensitivity. A very high biological sensitivity score comes from the presence of important habitat for a wide range of marine and coastal life. A soft substrate and tidal flats contribute to a very high physical sensitivity score. Important use of water, sheltered anchorages for small boats, fishing, and the community of Kitkatla all contribute to a high socioeconomic sensitivity score. So this web map provides everyone with the ability to dig down and discover this level of information about anywhere along the coast that they're interested in. As I mentioned before, this web map is live, and the link was sent to the chat. It will also be sent out with the recording of this session in case you missed it earlier. Please feel free to explore it and to learn more about the sensitivity of our coast to oil spills. Thank you all. I'm now going to hand it over to Edward, who's our Director of Communications, and he'll be moderating our closing Q&A section.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Edward Downing. I'm the Communications Director at ClearSeas, and I'd like to thank you, Jim, for that part of the presentation. It's very interesting, and also thanks to all our presenters. Now that we've concluded the main presentations, we do have some time for some questions. And the first question actually was Sebastian from, I believe, from Ottawa. And he wanted to know whether the session would be recorded. And yes, in fact, it will be. You will be sent a link after the seminar at the very end. And you will get a recording of the entire event. And you will be able to share it with your colleagues. Another question, this is maybe I'll hand over to Jim. For each layer in the list, there's a drop-down menu with an option that says show item details, then ask me to log in. Is there a way to find out more details or metadata about each layer? So Jim, could you answer that?
Yes, thank you, Edward. That's an excellent question. So beside each layer, show item details, and this should take you to, it does ask you to log in. Okay, that is something I will look into, and we'll send you an email with an answer afterwards. Yes. Thanks very much for the question. We'll follow up with that.
As Jim says, we can follow up, and if you have any questions that aren't answered or that you think of a little later, please ensure that you send them to us. Here's a question that's come in, and I'm going to give this over to Paul. Very interesting project. Have you had any response from government or other agencies or organizations who want to use the sensitive coastal area map and report? So Paul, could you answer that question?
Sure, thanks, Edward. And maybe should we get all the panelists up again on the screen, like a bit of a panel? There we go, Jim, thanks, and Dave and Jen, great. It's still fairly early days. I mean, we got the report was published only a couple of weeks ago. And so we've had some pretty positive responses, actually from a number of groups. Interestingly, from a lot of the people in the communities themselves, actually. We got some publicity through some of the local newspapers that featured the tool. We've had some interesting interactions with local people in those communities. The question was around, I think the question was around government agencies and organizations. We've had some excellent interaction with stakeholders and interested groups in government as we were producing the report and getting feedback. So I think Environment and Climate Change Canada was involved, Canadian Wildlife Services, Transport Canada, and representatives from Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And we've also had comments from the Coastal First Nations organization that have helped to contribute in reviewing the report at various stages as we've put it together. So we anticipate there'll be interest and usage from those parties as they get to know the report and see the results. Interesting development is recently, as we were in discussions with representatives from Transport Canada the Enhanced Maritime Situational Awareness, the EMSA platform, which some of you may be familiar with. And what we're intending to do is to release this data through that platform, because we think that's a great way to give people access to it and to help further the dialogue about developing the tool further. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. I have a series of more questions that have just come through. I think this one might be for Jen. It's from Francis. And if anyone else wants to jump in, feel free. But question is, can you explain why the entire offshore area is shown as unknown substrate when we do have information about seamounts, for example? So Jen, would you like to answer that question?
I might pass that to Dave. You might have a little bit more of the technical information that goes behind that.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah. So can you explain why the entire offshore area is shown as unknown substrate when we do have information about seamounts? So over to you, Dave. Thank you.
Yep. No, thank you for the question. At the time, when we looked at the publicly available data sets that we could access and download, the data set that we pulled for substrate didn't have any offshore substrate details on it. It was unclassified at the time. Now that knowing that there is some data available, that's something that in the future we could look at and update in a future iteration of this model.
Okay, thank you.
That answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dave. Another question. This is from Gerald Graham, and I know we follow each other. Of course, he follows Gerald, and he follows us on Twitter. But are there plans to do a CSA for the Salish Sea? That's where most of the shipping is, including tankers. So maybe Paul, would you like to answer that question?
Sure. We absolutely are interested in broadening our analysis. As the questioner points out, Salish Sea is an activity there's a region of high shipping activity, and hopefully that will be highlighted. You'll see when our vessel traffic analysis report comes out, you'll see that highlighted. So we're definitely interested, and so we're hoping to develop the methodology a bit in this context, and kind of hone those skills a bit, and then we'd like to apply it both to the Salish Sea. And we've also had a lot of interest from questions. I know, Edward, you've noted that on social media from some of our interest groups in the St. Lawrence and in Quebec area about applying the same methodology to that region. I think we'll also need to develop the methodology a bit further for, I think as Jennifer mentioned in her section, in the narrow channels and waterways, there'll need to be some adaptations to the methodology to make it appropriate for those kinds of inlets. But in summary, yes, it's definitely our intention, and it's obviously subject to us getting the right kind of resources and direction to allow us to do that, but it's certainly of interest to us.
Okay, Paul, thanks very much for that. And thanks to Gerald for your question. And just wanted to recognize Lolo. She, I believe, had sent a similar question. Are there plans to conduct a similar analysis in the Salish Sea? If so, when? So we've covered that off. But thanks again for the question to both Lolo and Gerald. Another question that's just come through is maybe I might ask Paul to tackle this one. Please explain how you anticipate adding the First Nations information into this, into the study, into this framework. So sorry, please explain how you anticipate adding the First Nations information into this framework. So maybe Paul, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's an interesting time for us to address that question. We've recently added a new member to the team here at Clear Seas. Sarah Thomas is our manager of Indigenous and Coastal Community Relations, and she's taken charge of a program of building in relations and developing the dialogue with Indigenous communities. So I think, as Dave mentioned, the interactive web tool is totally transparent and available and flexible, and our intention is to build on the dialogues that we've already begun to understand where does traditional knowledge help us to understand sensitivity. So we're acutely aware that in many cases there are bodies of traditional knowledge that could help us to better understand some of these sensitivity categories. And so what's needed is the development of a mechanism to integrate that traditional knowledge and understand how it differs from the assessment and how the assessments that we've conducted can be included. It's a resource intensive process, and we recognize that many of the communities that hold that knowledge have a lot of different priorities. And so, you know, one of the things we want to make sure is that we are, that those activities are appropriately resourced and that they are a priority to the communities involved. So there's a lot of factors to take into consideration. And as we are developing that program of work, we're hoping to pilot that approach with communities that want, that see that as a priority and that can devote the resources to doing it. And we'll hope to have the results of those for you to consider in due time.
And I'll just add to that we did contact First Nations early in the initial phases of the project, and we heard that there was value in the research that we were doing and that there was an interest in contributing, but that, as Paul mentioned, the level of effort to produce the right kind of data at the level that would go into a public map like this, that respect the privacy of information, would be quite considerable. So as Paul very well explained, it's a longer process and something that we want to do right if we're going to work with First Nations to do that. So.
Okay, thanks, Jen, and thanks, Paul. Another question. Lots of good questions coming in. Really appreciate the fact that you've taken the time to do this. It's good dialogue. And this is from Lee Britton, and I think I recognize Lee from some of our social media discussions too. So welcome aboard. For data, the question is, and I think this will probably be for Dave. For data sets such as Shorzone, which I believe you have used, how often will the data set get updated? Shorzone adds new and updated data almost every year, and so will the model be updated accordingly.
Thank you for the question. I'll answer the first part, and then I might turn it over to Jennifer to sort of expand on that. As I said, the model is able to be updated at any time. The model was built with flexibility in mind, so as new data becomes available, it can be integrated into the model can be run, and the new data can then be published and displayed. How often that is going to occur, I can't answer that. I'll have to defer to ClearSeas on that, as it is their product. But the tool can update whenever new information becomes available.
Yeah, and I'll add to that we've just released this as the first tool in the first iteration of the report, so we don't have a timeline or a schedule yet in when we're going to push out next iterations. But I think this first phase of putting it out to the public and gaining your feedback and understanding of what would be important to include as we go forward is part of that process and that timeline. So.
And I'll jump in there and a thought. I mean, it's also interesting to see. This is only one aspect of the marine spatial planning dialogue that we're engaged in. So as Jennifer mentioned, our marine transportation corridors initiative includes, if you have to assess both the risk of a spill. So this tool provides something on the sensitivity, but I think we've got work underway to analyze where are the ships going and what types of ships are going where, which helps to understand the risk. And so we're interested to see how this tool, and it's an innovative combination of information that's probably not normally available at the scale and kind of level of abstraction that allows you to combine it with spatial analysis of ship traffic and therefore risk. So we really want to develop the technique a bit further and say, okay, does this type of information in this level of detail and this level of scale provide an information that's relevant to people who are conducting marine spatial planning? And so we need to find out. And so I think, as I said before, we want to adapt the methodology to make sure that it's providing the right information at the right level of detail before we go slavishly updating the details. I mean, there's lots of improvements we could make, but I think the really interesting piece is what, how is this information useful? We believe that combining this kind of information in a format like this will provide a really interesting component of that overall risk analysis and risk management process. But we need to test that. And actually to that end, we should probably mention we have a community of practice of risk analysts and people who use risk tools called the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum. You can find more details of that on our webpage. And so I think one component of that forum will be to say, well, let's take some of this analysis and see how useful it is and what changes would need to be made before we move on to the next phase of work. So I encourage you, if you're an interested party in analyzing risk, or you're a user of this kind of data in marine spatial planning, encourage you to take a look at that Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum details, and perhaps even join our community of practice if that's an area that's of interest to you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that. That's very comprehensive. I'm going to say this is our last question. This is a really good one too. And I guess I'm going to ask maybe Paul just to maybe take a run at this, but it's from Sebastian. So second question, I appreciate all your input. I work for SIGRAM in Quebec. We are in the process of developing a similar index for the St. Lawrence. We would be interested in knowing more about the methodology used, the problems encountered. Could we contact a specific person to learn more? I guess yes, of course. We certainly can put you in touch with people, but maybe Paul, you just like to just elaborate on that.
Yes, I think we're developing relationships with partner organizations in Quebec at the moment, and so that would be a great connection to make. So it would be fantastic to make connection with Sebastian and his team that are working on this right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone again for all your questions. If you think of something else later on, just send us a message at info@clearseas.org, or contact us on our social channels. We're all on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And generally, just never hesitate to reach out to us for any questions you may have on this research or any of the other things that we do.